November is the Dr. C. Harold Deutsch lecture. I just asked, many former students and former faculty members would often come to this presentation. And luckily, November was his month to speak, and luckily we have CDs made and films of him giving these lectures, so we do have a great legacy of his lectures and such. He spoke often about his times doing OS in the Research and Analysis Division of the OSS under William Langer and Wild Bill Donovan. He also traveled to Germany in 1936, where he interviewed German city government leaders like Karl Girdler, the Lord Mayor of Leipzig, and the future leader of the July 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler. Deutsch also spoke about his trip in 1938 and his attempt to interview 100 leaders of World War I. He was able to get 98 of them, but he did not meet the Kaiser. The Kaiser was off in his little castle. And finally, he often also spoke of one of his most fascinating interviews with the Nazi leaders in the summer of 1945, when he was on loan from the OSS to the State Department, where he was able to speak to German prisoners like Heinz Guderian, Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, and Walter Warlimont. When he passed in 1995, Don decided that not only should the round table be named after him, but the month of November meeting should be dedicated to topics relating to his research and life. And in the past, we've had many speakers like Doug Waller, who discussed Wild Bill Donovan, David Kahn talking about code breaking in World War II, Ken Heckler presenting his interrogations of German prisoners at Mondorf, Luxembourg. And by the way, Deutsch would also have used Heckler's interviews when he was doing some research. Greg Peterson of the Robert Jackson Institute speaking on the Nuremberg trials. Peter Hoffman speaking on the conspiracy against Hitler. Michael Basler on the forgotten trials of the Holocaust. We also had last year Ben Stile talking about the Bretton Woods agreements. In addition to Dr. Deutsch's life, the World War II Roundtable has collected over the years hundreds of stories from World War II veterans, and most notably, one of the most famous generals of Minnesota era is General John Vesey, who was a good friend and poker-playing buddy of Dr. Harold Deutsch. And I would have just given anything to have been a fly on the corner, sitting at a poker table with those two gentlemen. We've also had many politicians speak, such as former Senator Rudy Boschwitz, discussing how his family escaped Europe and the Holocaust. Not only a senator, but we've also had the former boy governor of Minnesota, Harold Stassen, who spoke to the roundtable about his naval career and being on the deck of the USS Missouri when the Japanese surrendered. It was always a great pleasure of mine when I first started coming to the roundtable to be sitting next to Harold Deutsch and listen often to his side commentary about the speakers. Sometimes he looked like he was asleep, but then when all of a sudden they said something that he didn't find necessarily correct, he would raise his head and start to have to ask a question, and you knew you were in trouble then. So to introduce our main speaker tonight is one of Harold Deutsch's last students, and also considered one of his best students. He had two students that he considered his top tier. One was a guy named Dennis Showalter, who, if you don't know who he is, just pick up a book on tank warfare and such in World War II. And also Dr. Christopher Seimer, who is a lecturer at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. Chris and Dr. Deutsch would sit around a lot and discuss ancient history and Nazi Germany for hours on end. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Christopher Seimer.
Well, the subject of propaganda is one that has sort of been neglected academically, I fear, even though its presence in our lives is stronger now than ever. And in its simplest definition, propaganda can be described as using a media of any sort to deliver a message that will produce the desired effect in the target audience. And the thing about propaganda is that it is a effort to short-circuit thinking. It appeals to the emotions. And so vivid imagery and simple sloganeering are characteristics of all types of propaganda. The National Socialist regime in Germany will be one of the most expert in the use of propaganda alongside the Soviet Union and later other states to mold public opinion, to literally, as Jacques Ellul in his book, Propaganda, the formation of men's attitudes. Propaganda is not meant to make you learn anything, it's to make you feel something. And so the message in propaganda is often very simple and very direct. Our side is nothing but good. The enemy is the worst type of person imaginable. They're devils, they're evil. Or the strength of our soldiers is reliant upon the strength of the home front. And these simple messages repeated again and again, propaganda will become incessant, ubiquitous, and repetitious. And in this way, the propaganda message is almost absorbed, is meant to be absorbed subconsciously in many respects, in that you aren't, Hitler in his chapter on propaganda in his work Mein Kampf will say that you aren't doing a dissertation, you're trying to move the masses and the masses are stupid. And so we'll see the types of propaganda that were used in World War II and by the National Socialist regime. Now initially the target or the motive of the propaganda was of course to build up the political strength of the Nazis during their rise to power. And what's kind of interesting is the many different types of messages that were portrayed in Nazi propaganda at the time. Initially, the Nazis were very vociferous, but they'll actually sort of soften the image of Hitler as his efforts to gain power become closer and closer by 1932, for example. You won't see Hitler posing in an army uniform, or he'll be in a suit and with a tie and trying to appear as a normal bourgeois politician. And he's portrayed as the only reasonable choice to the Germans. Unsere letzte Hoffnung, as one of the posters will say, our last hope. And upon achieving victory, or I should say when he took power in the cabinet deal in January 30th, 1933, then the propaganda starts to shift to the rebuilding the new Germany, the positive messaging, all the great things that the great Führer has accomplished for the Germans. And at the same time, of course, describing the nefarious enemies of Germany that threaten this marvelous national renaissance and rebirth. Culminating, of course, in the marvelous show of the 1936 Olympics, which Dr. Deutsch attended in Berlin, a great showpiece for the achievements of the regime. And I might note the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda. I always sort of have an ironic smile when I see the celebration of the Olympics today, with the famous running of the torch, which captures the imagination, is a marvelous image of athletic prowess, and this was invented by Goebbels for the 1936 Olympics, which will then later play a conspicuous part in the beginning of Leni Riefenstahl's award-winning film Olympiad. The Nazis will be among the first to use motion pictures extremely effectively as propaganda mechanisms, and they'll actually begin to use television in the 1930s on an extremely limited basis. And I believe you've seen one of the ironies of life is that the broadcast into the intergalactic ether among the first television that aliens are going to pick up is Nazi television shows from 1936. God knows what E.T.'s going to make of that. But of course, then the messaging begins to change, and particularly when we get to the war. Well, again, in wartime, one is to bolster hope on the home front, and the other is to castigate the devilish enemy, and in the early years of the war, to celebrate the invincibility of the German war machine. But as things began to turn against the Reich, the themes in the propaganda become much more dark. National sacrifice, the imagery of the soldiers is as desperate last-ditch defenders rather than conquering heroes. And the efforts to keep the morale up on the home front took on really intense measures. Also, the demonization of the opponents, and of course in the National Socialist worldview, Russians and Americans and British may be really, really bad, but behind all of them was the Nazi fantasy of the international Jewish conspiracy. And so we start seeing ever more clearly, overtly anti-Semitic messaging in Nazi propaganda once the war has started. Now, interestingly, today we're similarly completely inundated with this type of messaging, this type of propaganda works on us. The closest cognate to the types of posters, for example, that were so common in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s are memes today. What's a meme? It's a picture with a simple slogan on it. Are they ubiquitous? Do you see them everywhere? And what we start to see in the use of modern media is now we have mechanisms of propaganda distribution that someone like Goebbels would have dreamed about in that, and we see in the, shall we say, the declining capacity of people to not see things in simple terms of my side is all right and the enemy side is all bad. This is the kind of simple, repetitious messaging that, of course, propaganda excels at. And so, as we start to, we are finding ourselves being contained in what are referred to as information silos, where we only get the messaging that the propagandists know appeals to us, and we don't hear different points of view and things like that. I might note we're seeing a resurgence of very conspicuous and apparently effective anti-Semitic propaganda now in the context of the activities of the terrorist group Hamas. So, on the one hand, this is a very fascinating historical topic to see how the different types of messaging that was used by the Third Reich so effectively. I might note, German morale didn't crack until very much the last weeks of the war. And the SS had a specific office that was to monitor public opinion. The Nazis were very concerned for this. And significantly, almost to the last, the Germans believed that there were going to be miracle weapons that would save the day, or that the Fuhrer had a secret plan that would bail them out. And so German resistance really didn't begin to crack until very, very close to the end, which showed just how deeply enthralled the German population was from the propaganda messaging of the Third Reich. And so I would like you to study this type of stuff in today's lecture and try to be conscious of when you detect, as you go about your day, when you're being manipulated by simple, emotion-packed messaging designed to produce a desired effect. Because the propagandist, as Hitler would say, the propagandist doesn't want you to think, they only want you to feel. And on that note, I will introduce our speaker tonight, Randall Bytwerk.
Early May 1945, an American GI from Oklahoma was wandering around Munich. Now, the Nazis, one of their great propaganda successes was to persuade people that Germans were going to turn into werewolves and conduct guerrilla warfare against the Allies, that there was an Alpine redoubt, a fortress in the Alps, in which the Nazis would have bitter resistance to the end. But you know what? It was propaganda. It didn't exist. And so our GI from Oklahoma was having a fine time wandering around Munich, which was in rubble. He walked past a big building, and that building had on the top of it Hofbräuhaus. It happened to, he may not have known this, but it was the bar, beer hall, where many of Hitler's meetings had been held. Now it was in bad shape. There was a hole in the roof from bomb damage. There was rubble all over the place. But on the wall, there was a painting. This painting. He looked at it and said, I like it. Took it out of his frame, put it in a map case, and took it back to Oklahoma. 70 years later, his daughter sent me a picture saying, what is this thing? Well, one of the things it is, the outline of my address this evening. I'm going to argue that that painting depicts the principles of Nazi propaganda in a kind of pseudo-religious sense. There's a school of thought going back to the 30s of political religion, which viewed the totalitarian movements of the 20th century as a kind of modern-day religion, with many of the characteristics of traditional religion. Now, I have to say that when Don Patton first asked me to give this talk, I wondered if he knew what he was doing. Because I am not, this is predominantly a forum for military historians. I am not a military historian. But I said, why not? I'll do it. I looked over the history of the group, and lo and behold, there were talks about things other than military history. And then I started looking into some of Harold Deutsch's work. And in one of his essays for the Army War College, he had a discussion of the political religion of totalitarian systems. So I decided that, yep, Don Patton knew what he was doing when he invited me. Well, religions have a variety of things, but there might be 4 characteristics of religion in politics and propaganda we're going to look at. We're going to look at propaganda as, first of all, presenting a kind of deity, a kind of God in a religious sense. We're going to look at the content, the theology, if you will, of propaganda. We're going to look at ways of worship. How do you practice this kind of Nazi faith? And then we're going to look at Nazi principles of heaven and hell. Okay? So, here is that slide again. And look at the center. An enormous Adolf Hitler. Absolutely huge, towering over everything, including even the surprisingly large boy behind him. Okay? Now, the Nazis did not literally believe that Hitler was God, but they believed he was very close to it. For example, this is a widely reproduced Nazi image titled, in the beginning was the word, in Anfang war das Wort, the opening of the Gospel of John. Hitler is speaking as an evangelist to his early followers in 1920. Hermann Goering, in the 30s, said, "We National Socialists believe in the depths of our heart that the Fuhrer is infallible on all political and social matters affecting the interests of the people. The word he used in German is the same word that Catholics use for the infallibility of the Pope. Now, the interesting thing is that if you're Catholic, you'll know that the Pope rarely makes infallible pronouncements. I think it's been used twice since the doctrine was proclaimed. But note what Goering says. Hitler is infallible on everything that might show up in the interests of the German people. The Nazis had a weekly quotation poster printed in huge editions, hundreds of thousands. These were plastered every week all over Germany, and they had quotations from Hitler. They had quotations from Nazi leaders, from great German past. This one was from 1941, and it translates as, "The Führer is always right." Art. There was a large number of paintings like this. What do we have here? We've got Hitler looking into the glorious Nazi future, standing on the battlefield, towering over everything. But it showed up in smaller ways. This is an image of a mother and her two children. Note that in the center, there's a picture of the father, who's off fighting somewhere on the front. Above, primal place, more important than the father, is Adolf Hitler, with beneath him a candle, something like a votive candle that you might find in a church underneath the picture of a saint. There was what you could only call hymns to Adolf Hitler, an enormous number of poems praising Hitler. This one, "There are so many people who bless you, even if their blessing is a silent one. There are so many who have never met you, but you are their Savior." And it is the same word Christians would use about Jesus Christ. Sometimes the vision of you brings life to those in the midst of hard labor and heavy obligation. So many are devoted to you and seek in your spirit a clear light. Thousands of these, printed in newspapers, magazines, books, you name it. So Hitler was presented as an almost infallible person, perhaps not Zeus, perhaps not Thor, but if nothing else, at least waiting for the next opening in the Trinity for his admission. Well, religions have a god of some kind, but they also have a theology. And the picture shows various aspects of Nazi theology. You've got hard work. You've got the glorious physical strength of the German worker. You've got the marching men, because the world is a dangerous place and it has to be fought. And so what happens basically is that the Nazis do lots of things to manifest what their beliefs are. Goebbels was speaking to his propagandists in Berlin in 1928, before they took power, said, "You will never find millions of people who are willing to die for a book, but millions of people are willing to die for a gospel. And our movement is becoming more and more a gospel." And again, the word used is exactly the word that Christians would use for the Christian gospel. Later, what Goebbels says is revolutions are breakthroughs of new world views. He said if a worldview is to be what it says, it cannot accept tolerating only a small part of theology, only a small part of the world. It must appeal to everything. It must change all aspects of human life until the people, the nation, and the state are one and the same. And they meant that. National Socialism was not like a weak religious believer who might go to church on Sunday morning and forget about it the rest of the week. Rather, Nazism was a worldview. It was intended to appeal to everything. And they meant everything. Just for example, came across an article about interior decoration in 1938. And the article said, look, you should be able to wander into the home of a Nazi and know that person is a Nazi simply by the furnishings, by the art, by the things on the wall. Now, if interior decoration falls under the purview of the party worldview, what doesn't fall under it? Now, religions have to be both simple and complex, okay? For instance, take Christianity. Christianity can be summarized really very simply. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy mind, and with all thy soul. And the second principle like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. Goebbels said exactly the same was true of a political worldview. It had to be put in a sentence that could be understood by everyone. And then it had to have greater depth, of course, too. So, for example, the Nazi principle, the one-sentence principle, was the common good before the individual good. The fundamental principle of Nazi propaganda, everything for one's people, everything for the nation. You were simply a small part of the machine, and if you were to perish, the world, the race, would go on. And so there was a tremendous emphasis in Nazism on sacrifice, on being willing to give everything, if necessary, for the greater glory of the German folk. But of course, there have to be greater depths than that. Just like Christianity can be summarized very simply, on the other hand, you've got Thomas Aquinas, you've got St. Augustine, you've got John Calvin, who would give greater depth to it. And so the Nazis had developed theology as well, of which we'll look at a few parts that showed up in propaganda. One significant part was the notion of race. This, if there was a fundamental principle that covered everything, it was that notion of race. Okay? And this is a cover of an interesting magazine. It's designed for the people who are running Hitler Youth meetings. All German kids, 99.8% or so, were members of the Hitler Youth. And the Hitler Youth gathered to have fun and games, sing songs, the kinds of things the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts might do. But each week, each meeting also had what you might call a catechism session. That is, the leader would talk to the youth about what they had to know to be good Nazis. And this is one that says, to be a people is the religion of our age. Okay? So, propaganda would tell people that they were part of a great tradition. They were part of a German race that went back to the deepest roots of the past. And the genes, if you will, flowed through to the existing Germans, who were not really all that important. They were simply a way to transmit the greatness of Germany onward. This kind of material was presented in enormous numbers of ways, in education, in speeches, you name it. There was an emphasis on the greatness, the spectacular importance of the German race. Now, if there is the good race, there must be the bad one. And of course, we've already heard a reference to the nature of the Jews. This is the front cover of Julius Streicher's newspaper Der Stürmer from 1943. The heading over the picture of this rather nefarious-looking Jew is Satan. The Jews literally were the devil incarnate, the devil made flesh. If Christ in Christian theology was God made flesh, the Jew in Nazi theology was the devil made flesh. The Nazis didn't say that everything wrong with the world was the fault of the Jews, but almost everything. Here, for example, is a cover from Nazi humor magazine. They had a number of humor magazines. They generally weren't all that funny when they got to political issues. But here we have, from 1943, Uncle Sam, you'll note, is chewing up the British lion. Uncle Sam is being eaten by the communist. And guess what? Who is devouring Uncle Sam? The Jew. The sheer amount of anti-Semitic propaganda in the Third Reich is absolutely astonishing. I know because I've seen a lot of it, and I'm probably one of the only people, I may be the only person alive today who's actually looked through every issue in the sad 20-year history of Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer. But not only there, I don't care if it was films, plays, literature, newspapers, speeches, you name it. The devil was the Jew. One of the interesting things about propaganda is that it cannot tolerate dissent. That is, the Nazi argument was that they had truth with a capital T. Okay? There could not be dissent from the Nazi point of view. As was mentioned, Nazi propaganda tended to use the three principles that Hitler talked about in Mein Kampf: simplicity, repetition, and emotional appeal. Now, these may be the principles of marketing and advertising, but the difference is this. Marketing is trying to sell you Coca-Cola. Propaganda is trying to sell you a worldview. And that worldview encompassed just about everything. One of the reasons why they were so hard on dissent is really the same reason why many religions are hard on dissent. Basically, religions tend to have three groups of people. You've got the true believers, the good guys. You've got the pagans or the infidels. Now, they've got the wrong religion, and that's bad. But they're so far wrong that they're hardly worth considering. Then there's the third category, heretics. Heretics are ones who claim to be members of the true religion, but they disagree about the principles. In other words, they suggest that absolute truth might not exist. There might be dissent about whether the Fuhrer was actually infallible. Okay? And so Nazism pushed unanimity of views. Dissent was crushed in as many ways as possible. And this shows up in so many ways. Heil Hitler. Every day. Over and over and over again. Heil Hitler. Heil Hitler. One way of enforcing obedience. Because you see, sometimes our attitudes determine our behaviors. But at least as often, our behaviors change our attitudes. We behave in a certain way, and then we try to figure out why are we like that. If we behave as the Nazis want, we become Nazis through that consistent repetition of behaviors. One could say a lot more about Nazi propaganda, but I got 40 minutes. We've got a God, we've got a theology, we've got ways of worship. Why do people go to church, or to mosque, or to synagogue? One of the reasons they go is because the community builds strength. We are reinforced in what we feel and believe by others. And so the Nazis found all kinds of ways to do that. Ways of worship. Look here at the worshipful woman here. These are women who have seen their God. Okay? If you've seen Triumph of the Will, which most of you will have seen at least parts of, you see the almost worship, not almost, the worshipful glances that people give to Adolf Hitler. Goes back to Dostoevsky. Some of you have read The Brothers Karamazov, and in that book for a while he stops telling the story of the brothers, and one of the brothers tells a story about the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor is the guy conducting the Inquisition in Spain, where every day heretics were being burned for the glory of God. And the peculiar thing happens in the story. Christ returns to Seville and walks the streets, Dostoevsky says. He says nothing. And yet the peculiar thing is everybody knows who he is. Everybody recognizes it is Christ. And the Grand Inquisitor hears about it. The Grand Inquisitor calls Christ in. Christ says nothing. The Grand Inquisitor says, I know who you are and you have no right to be here before your time. And Christ says nothing. The Grand Inquisitor says, I know you know what we have done. You know that we have joined the other side. But we have done that because the gospel you gave to people failed. You gave people freedom, openness. They did not know what to do with it. He said the chief craving of community of worship is the chief misery of every man individually and of all of humanity from the beginning of time. For the sake of common worship, they've slain each other with the sword. They've set up gods and challenged one another. Put away your gods and come and worship ours, or we will kill you and your gods. The Grand Inquisitor says people can be motivated by three forces: by miracle, by mystery, by authority. All of those the church provided. You took those, some of them, away from people. They didn't know what to do. We are giving people back what they want. Well, the Nazis did very much the same. They found ways of expressing and getting people involved in the Nazi faith. Religion, for example, has holidays, the calendar of, say, Christian holidays, Christmas, Easter, and so on. The Nazis developed their own pantheon of holidays. January 30th, the anniversary of Hitler's beer hall putsch, okay? February 24th, the party platform proclamation. April 20th was Hitler's birthday. September was the great festival of Nazism, the Nuremberg rallies. The most sacred day on the Nazi calendar was November 9th, the anniversary of the beer hall putsch, and this is a painting of that. This was a remarkable event. Every year in Munich, they reenacted the March of 1923, when Hitler's followers had marched from the beer hall, Hofbräuhaus, which we just heard about, to the center of Munich, where the original procession had been shot up, okay? Along the way, there were these smoking pylons. Each pylon had the name of one of the 400 and some people who had died fighting for Hitler before 1933. And as the procession drew abreast of each pillar, a deep voice boomed out over loudspeakers, "Hans Schweidner Richter!" followed by the next name, and the next name, and the next name. The procession ended in the center of Munich, where the original procession had been shot up in 1923, and where nearby the Nazis erected the so-called honor temples. Two open-air, semi-Grecian temples. They exhumed the 16 people who had died in 1923 and buried them, 8 of them, in each of these so-called honor temples. When Hitler spoke at the dedication of this, he said, talking to his followers almost as if they were there, "You, my comrades, have won after all. You may have died, but the cause you fought for continues and triumphed through you." In the words of the Nazi Party's song, the Horst Wessel song, "Comrades shot by Red Front and reaction, march in spirit within our ranks." Somehow the Nazi dead had almost risen. Nuremberg. Some of you will have seen this scene from Triumph of the Will, a painting here. One of the things that happens is that after they've marched through these huge columns, Hitler is dedicating new party standards. And he does that by holding in one hand the cloth of what the Nazis called the blood banner. This was the flag that was stained with the blood of the martyrs of 1923. And the Nazis used that word, the martyrs of 1923. Hitler would hold in one hand that flag, and he would move with somber music in the background from one new party standard to the other. And he would touch the new standard. Somehow, mysterious force would flow from the blood banner through Adolf Hitler to the new banner. This is obviously a religious type of literature. By the way, this was not only held, these things were not only held in major cities, in Munich or whatever. The Nazis had a huge system, an enormous system, to provide guidelines for every town and village in Germany as to how to hold these. So you wouldn't have the November 9th ceremonies only in Munich. You'd have it everywhere. A small village with 100 people would be given instructions on what they could do, texts they could use, what music they could play with, maybe 1 or 2 musicians. A big city would have a symphony orchestra. Every year, these were repeated over and over and over and over again. And it was not only that. The Nazis developed their own versions of what morning prayers or evensong, say in the Anglican tradition. Good Nazis could gather together in the morning and have a brief sermon about Nazism. Okay? The Nazis developed their own rituals of birth, marriage, and death. A good Nazi would be, he'd have his children dedicated by the local party leader. He would be married by the local party leader. He would be buried by the party leader. Now, the Nazis didn't get off to a great rapid start on this. In 1941, their own estimates were they had about 1% of the market for these kinds of festivities. But that did not bother them. That did not bother them. because they were playing for the long term, the 1,000-year Reich. A book on how to hold Nazi ceremonies said, look, how did Christianity take over in Germany? It didn't only suppress past religions, but it absorbed them. So the winter solstice was absorbed into Christmas. Spring solstice was taken into Easter. Gradually, the pagans became Christians without knowing it. The concepts of their beliefs changed, and that's what they were doing. They didn't expect this was going to happen tomorrow or the next day, or even within a generation, but they were preparing for the future. Here's just an example of one of those small ceremonies in a town, Hitler's birthday. Hitler Youth, boys, girls, Hitler in the middle. A town of 100 people, 200 people, 300 people could do this because the Nazis wanted this to be omnipresent. You could not escape the unanimity of propaganda. As a sidelight, it even extended to the grave. This is a bad tombstone. Look at it. It's obvious what's wrong with it. Look what's on top, a cross. The swastika is smaller, and it's at the bottom. This was held in Nazi propaganda literature as an example of how not to do it. Here's how to bury a Nazi. This is a proper tombstone. No cross, but the swastika is pretty visible. Well, heaven and hell. We've seen a God, we've seen a theology, we've seen ways of worship. Religions, not always, but usually, have some kind of vision of the future, some notion of evil. And in this case, you've got in the distance the kind of threatening clouds and thunder showers. But on the other hand, look at the whole, there's brightness, the planes are flying. It's going to get better. It's going to get better. Hitler, one of those weekly quotation posters I talked about, said the German people and its soldiers today are working and fighting not only for themselves in their day, but also for coming even the most distant generations. There was going to be a Nazi heaven on earth, but it might take a while. Here we have the sacrifice theme, just after Stalingrad. Picture of the Nazi Party newspaper. They died so that Germany might live. Stalingrad calls for action. Because although they might have died at Stalingrad, lo and behold, their sacrifice would bring that great German future. Even in 1945, this is February of 1945, Joseph Goebbels, writing in his weekly lead article for the newspaper Das Reich, it's titled The Year 2000. He says, in the year 2000, the German nation will be the intellectual leader of civilized humanity. We are earning that right in this war. Our children and their children will erect monuments to their fathers and mothers for the pain they suffered, for the stoic steadfastness with which they bore all, for the bravery they showed, for the heroism with which they fought, for the loyalty with which they held to their Führer and his ideals in difficult times. Our hopes will come true in their world, and our ideals will be reality. We must never forget that when we see the storms of this wild age reflected in the eyes of our children. Let us act so that we will earn their eternal blessings, not their curses. February 1945. The same month, the front cover of the Völkischer Beobachter, the party daily newspaper. The miracle, note the religious language, the miracle of German confidence in victory. Now, there was a problem in February of 1945, and for that matter, after 1943 and Stalingrad. There wasn't quite as much evidence for German victory as there had been before. And that's where the Nazis shifting, starting in Stalingrad and intensifying as the war went on, from not only the glories of the German future, when children would bless their great ancestors, but the notion of hell, of destruction came out. The Jew, the devil, was going to do things if Germany didn't win. 1943, if the homeland's courage fails, this is how Germany will look. The German soldier, wounded, looking over the ruins of Russia. You wouldn't have printed this cartoon in 1941 or 1942 because you wouldn't even want to suggest the possibility of losing. But in 1943, it becomes possible to imagine a German defeat. This is a fascinating pamphlet called Never, published in November of 1944. It summarizes all of the Nazi claims that if Germany lost the war, it would be destroyed completely. The favorite example of there is, in 1941, an American Jew named Kaufman had published a book at his own expense called Germany Must Perish. The argument was, he said, look, Germany has started 2 world wars. If we don't do something about it this time, they'll do it again. Now, it would be, he said, inhumane to kill all the Germans. So his solution was to sterilize all Germans. Okay? So the German race would die out by the natural course of time. Now, he was a crackpot in the United States. Nobody took him seriously. But the Germans found it, and they loved it. Okay? They presented this, they promoted him to a member of Franklin Roosevelt's Brain Trust. He was a spokesman for the world Jewish community. And, of course, what the point was is they meant it. If we lose this war, we're dead. We may as well go on fighting because they're going to kill us. There was an enormous amount of this material, and it increased as the war went on and as victory became less and less plausible, even though everybody still had to speak about victory. The Germans, by the way, were always told to say, after victory, this will happen. After victory. After victory. Okay? Never to allow the slightest hint in their own demeanor that the war might be lost. The whole argument is perhaps summarized in this cartoon from 1944. His way to liberate Europe. The Star of David on the forehead, the American flag, the Union Jack, the Star of the Soviets, and murder. This beast is going to come and wipe out Germany if we do not stop him. You know, it would be very pleasant to think that we had learned from the Nazi experience, that propaganda was shown for what it was, that it had lost its force. Would that that were true. I think that propaganda in the 21st century is more effective than the propaganda of the 20th century. And that's a long argument, and I'm going to give you a very brief version of it. Okay? In the past, propaganda was something that people were suspicious about because they knew it had central control. That also meant that propaganda had to be relatively careful. Goebbels, for example, rarely lied in his propaganda. He concealed a lot of things. He avoided a lot of things. But he used to write these weekly essays. And 6 months to a year later, they'd be reprinted in books. He didn't have to edit because he'd been so cautious in what he said that he couldn't be accused of factual inaccuracies. People were suspicious enough already. So if a newspaper, even a Nazi newspaper, was too far from what people thought, it lost credibility. The Nazis preferred to lie by indirection and by omission rather than by outright lies. But you know what? Life has changed now. There used to be people called editors, even for Nazi newspapers, who would stop the worst nonsense from appearing. We have now each become our own editor. We have each become our own propagandist. It isn't so much now that there is necessarily nefarious characters behind the scenes, propagandizing, modern-day Joseph Goebbels. There are those. But instead, we choose our own propaganda. We go to websites we agree with. The wonders of algorithms give us stuff that supports what we already think and doesn't give us stuff we disagree with. What happens, in other words, is that we are captives of our own prejudices, and we do nothing, or very little quite often, to disabuse ourselves of that because we do not see the opposition. We do not see the other perspective. Facebook, Twitter, the websites we visit, they don't do it. One of the reasons I think it's important to look in the past, which is a mirror, Because in the past we see reflections of today and the future. I think when we look at the mirror of the past, when we look at the content of Nazi propaganda in the 12 years it had power, in many ways I think we see a reflection of today, when there are even more people with their own infallible leaders, their own infallible propaganda, their own certainties, not open to dispute. I think we see the past is a reflection of the future, or, in the words that you've all heard from George Santayana, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Thank you.
What was the election propaganda that the Third Reich, the Nazis put forth?
Our website has some pre-1933 Nazi propaganda, but basically the Nazis argued that the country was a mess. And it was something of a mess, particularly after 1928 and 29 of the Great Depression. And so the Germans, the Nazis, simply followed the example of propaganda that we've already talked about. Simplicity, repetition, emotional appeal. Adolf Hitler was the one person who could save Germany. Nobody else could. Everybody else had failed. The Nazis presented an explanation of why Germany was in a mess. Germany had been stabbed in the back. How could it have lost World War I? Its troops were deep in France still. They'd knocked out the Russians the year before. And they somehow lost the war. The only explanation, and this was something Germans were just all too eager to believe, was that they'd been stabbed in the back, and of course, who stabbed in the back? The Jews. So that was a major theme. Then the Nazis presented optimism. They were the most optimistic of all German political parties. Their marching men, their cheers, their enthusiasm, their vision of the future. If you were a Nazi, you were an optimist. A lot of the other parties were pessimists from the Nazi point of view, and so that made them attractive. There are other things. One last point. One of the things the Nazis did is they developed political campaigning to an extent never before seen in Germany. That is, other parties campaigned during elections, and then they'd stop until the next election. The Nazis campaigned ceaselessly. They trained thousands of speakers by a correspondence course in public speaking. It worked. These weren't Goebbels-type speakers. But what happened was that the Nazis could send people to the small villages and towns all over Germany. No other party had ever sent a speaker to this town. But the Nazis did it not only once, but over and over and over again. And so the sheer insistence of Nazi propaganda had an enormous effect on Germany. They were the party of energy. They were the party of youth. They were a party of, no, we're not going to put up with it anymore.
I was curious, I'm familiar with the Horst Wessel's song, and I was wondering if there are other examples of them hijacking popular culture as a propaganda tool.
Well, they liked songs. I didn't even mention the fact that every Nazi political movement, the SA, the Hitler Youth, they had their own songbooks with their own music. Now, a lot of these used familiar tunes with new words, but the point was that you could sing Nazi songs whenever you wanted to. But then they took over all kinds of other things. I already mentioned in the previous session that they didn't use things like the radio and film as heavily in propaganda. They tried, but they found out that people weren't willing to pay good money for bad propaganda. So radio became more and more entertainment. Most Nazi films are fairly unobjectionable even today. There were heavily propaganda films, the three major anti-Semitic films of the 30s, Yud Sus and The Eternal Jew and so forth. Okay, there were those. But most popular culture, as long as it didn't dissent from Nazi point of view, was allowed. But then if it did, it was up a creek, like jazz, hated jazz. And so jazz, although a lot of Germans liked it, they tried to suppress that. On the other hand, they pushed German drama. They pushed great literature that they could be made to be consistent with Nazi views. I mean, basically, as I said, they were out for totality. Anything could be used for propaganda, they did.
Dr. Samer, anything to add to that?
Well, it was certainly true that another feature of the Nazi ideology was the greatness of German culture. And so therefore, promoting public concerts of the Philharmonic playing Beethoven was perfectly consistent with Nazi ideology, but to the audience would be innocuous. It wouldn't have a big propaganda message. But again, all in the context of this creation of what they called this kind of Volksgemeinschaft, the unity of the people in this great German culture that they were.
I think a little bit was mentioned on, as far as propaganda, is what was omitted. And it seems like today, when there's messages being portrayed by people with a particular mindset, things that don't fit the narrative don't exist.
Correct.
If they're not covered, they don't exist because most people don't know about them.
Let me give you an example along that same theme. Let's assume that I was mad at Don Patton. Okay? I talked to everybody who ever knew him, and I found all the bad things he'd ever done. He broke a heart of this poor girl in 10th grade. Okay? He made this little fib, he did this, that, and the other thing. I gathered all of this together. I could put together a devastating portrait of Don. Now Don might say, and I'd say, it's all true, isn't it? Is there anything that wasn't true? It's all true, isn't it? Okay? So the point is that by omission and by selection, propaganda is extraordinarily powerful. Yes?
There was the joke during the Cold War that the U.S. and the Soviet Union ran a race against each other, and the Soviet newspapers correctly and accurately reported that the Soviet Union came in second place, but the United States was next to last.
And it was true.
100% true.
Could you speak to the rivalry between the Nazis and the Reds, the communists of the early 1930s? We haven't talked much about how they attacked them.
That's a 45-minute answer. But it's a good question. What happened was that the Nazis and the communists were appealing in many ways to the same audiences. They were both proposing radical solutions, dramatic change to the parties in the center. The Nazi argument against the Marxists was that they were in control of the Jews. They were part of this international Jewish conspiracy. They were part of the evil Soviet empire. And the Nazis, not only the Nazis, but the Germans as a whole, most Germans, had a real fear of communism. Imagine our own Red Square of, Red Scares of the 50s in this country, and multiply it by about 10. And you've got the feelings that some Germans, many Germans, had about Marxism in the 1920s and early 1930s. So it was a lively controversy. The two battled each other a lot, and people would sometimes go from one to the other. They wanted a radical solution. Sometimes they decide the Nazis aren't radical enough, they'd go to the Marxists. Sometimes they'd go the other way. But a tremendous amount of effort, and Nazi propaganda from that period produced lots of information for its speakers on how to win people over from Marxism, what to say about the Marxists. Just for example, okay, one example. The Nazi meetings, as German meetings generally did, had a discussion period afterward. The speaker would speak for an hour, they'd throw it open for questions. The danger was, of course, if you weren't quick-witted, some Marxists could stand up and make a fool of you. Here's the advice Nazis gave to deal with Marxists. One of the Marxist slogans was, clobber the fascists wherever you meet them. Clobber the fascists wherever you meet them. So the speaker, you're the questioner, and I say, tell me, before I answer your question, do you affirm your party's slogan, clobber the fascists wherever you meet them? You're in a Nazi meeting. There are stormtroopers all over the place. What are you going to say? If you say yes, you might be beaten up. If you say no, you're a coward. You lose out of the way. They knew what they were doing.
This is both for the professor and our speaker for this evening. You've held up the mirror and given us some background of the last 70 or 80 years of what we refer to as propaganda. As we look forward, is it only despair? Is there any antidote, any sort of critical thinking that, is the best propaganda, is the best way to fight propaganda with more propaganda? I'm just be interested to hear your viewpoint on that, about the future and how we try to accommodate.
Do you want to solve that problem?
Hey, go ahead, son.
Easily.
Well, I think that you use the expression critical thinking, and you see, my analysis of propaganda has demonstrated that propaganda intends for you to not think. It panders to your prejudices. It gives you slogans, it gives you images that then can be easily pigeonholed in an undisciplined intellect. And so my advice, and this is what I encourage my students to do, is to expose yourself to as many different points of view as possible. And that doesn't mean that you're buying it, but it means that you're beginning to see different angles on any given question. And what's interesting is, because the most effective propaganda doesn't tell lies, but it lies by omission. It's what they don't say, that then one can kind of create a collage and get closer to the truth by many different sources. Frankly, I never read American media during elections. I only read foreign newspapers, because foreigners' perspective, they're all asking themselves the same question, which is, what are the crazy Americans going to do next? And so they see things that everyone else has got a dog in the fight. And so again, reading the Times of India, well, India's got its own axe to grind. One might detect a note of bias in their stories about Pakistan, for example. But nonetheless, their reporting on American politics is from a very different perspective, which I believe is the most effective tool to guarding oneself against being easily manipulated. Because that's what I see the struggle with propaganda is. I believe, when you find yourself reacting without thinking, you're probably a victim of propaganda. You've been conditioned to have a response. And it's the same thing. I mean, modern marketing works on this on very sophisticated levels. But I think that's the best tool that one can use, is to strive hard to have as broad a perspective as one can. And unfortunately, be willing to admit when you've been suckered. And that's probably the toughest part.
And I would agree with him, except the problem is that the people who most need to follow that advice don't follow that advice. When you look at, unpaid commercial, subscribe to your local newspapers. How many of you, I'm not going to embarrass you, but newspapers are dying right and left. Now, newspapers aren't infallible, far from it, but they have editors, and they present a range of opinions. That's why the slogan in the American right is, the mainstream media always lies. Okay? Don't believe it. If the New York Times says it's Tuesday, it's lying. I'm practically not exaggerating there. And so what people do is they go with memes. They go with short summaries. They don't get a wider view. Unlike you, I read American newspapers as well as international ones, but I subscribe to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They often have similar news coverage, but their editorial stances are dramatically different. I think that the world would be a lot better off if each of us had to read something regularly that disagreed with us. But you see, we don't do that anymore. Some of us do, obviously. In this group, I suspect many do. But for so many people, they only get the news that reinforces their existing. And if I had a solution to that, I would be a much happier person than I am now. But I do not have a solution to making people consider points of view other than their own. I wish I did.
Originally, my question was going to be how effective was the Nazi propaganda in the war effort. I believe Professor Seimer sort of explained that it went right down to the end, in the final weeks of the war. So it kept the Gemeinschaft, it kept the community fighting and supporting and the soldiers fighting. So I'm going to kind of change it a little bit to, can you give me a little comparison of the Nazi wartime propaganda effectiveness versus the Soviet wartime effectiveness during World War II? If you have that capability.
A brief response, read my book. No, by that I mean my book also covers the East Germans. And the slogan in East Germany was, to learn from the Soviet Union is to learn victory. And East German propagandists read in German translation, although many could read Russian, they read the Russian propaganda manuals and followed them, okay? So there is, first of all, a lot of similarities in basic techniques. A second difference, that I think is an interesting difference, is that although the Nazis did not have to change their propaganda very much when the war started, Stalin did. And suddenly Stalin became a friend of religion. Stalin became a friend of all kinds of people he had been killing happily for years beyond that. What Stalin did is he simply said, okay, guess what? I need these guys for the next few years. I'm going to be nice to them. And the Nazis didn't have to do that because the war was kind of consistent with their theology. But no, I mean, I am serious. My book does look at the similarities between the two versions of propaganda. There are great similarities, but they're not identical.
There's a very conspicuous difference, and my colleague pointed it out. You'll notice after the shock of Barbarossa, suddenly traditional Russian patriotic motifs start to appear in their propaganda. Whereas before then, there were very profoundly active campaigns to stamp out the symbology of the church, the Tsar, and the Rodina, the Mother Russia. And then very quickly you'll see Alexander Nevsky, the spirit of Alexander Nevsky, fighting alongside the Red Soldiers, and references to the motherland in danger, not the communist movement, not the workers, not the proletariat, but Mother Russia was at stake. Then, of course, once victory is achieved by some strange magic that only Stalin could really do, the communist message began to be reinforced, and with vigor, I might add. But churches were opened, and a variety of traditional actions the Russian government did at war were reproduced by Stalin. And it was definitely a radical change, of course, from the propaganda of only weeks before the Nazi invasion, really. And in fact, that sudden ideological shift was reflected in a schism in communist parties overseas, most conspicuously in the United States, where up to the moment the Soviet Union was invaded, communist parties promoted isolation and pacifism, and suddenly became vociferous supporters of U.S. entry into the war and defending Russia at all costs. And so you see, that caused an ideological rift among the American left over that. But that's the mercurial nature of Stalin's ability. But then after the war gets settled in, the greatness of the liberation of the peoples from the fetters of the regimes that the Red Army overthrew will be, of course, be a feature of Soviet propaganda. And you can still, they're tearing down some of those monuments now, but every place had a very friendly Russian soldier. The Austrians used to refer to it, the statue to the unknown rapist, but There you go.
For our speaker, the Nazis famously adopted a number of esoteric and supernatural beliefs as part of their own internal theology versus their external theology. Did this get employed in propaganda as a means to kind of inculcate gradual magical thinking to push people towards Nazi ideology, or theology as you put it?
Well, there was some of that. I mean, Himmler was notoriously interested in strange occultic practices of the past. Hitler thought that was kind of nonsense. And the major Nazi propagandists did not push that kind of mystic stuff about, the spear of destiny or ancient practices and so on. There was some of it, but it was not really part of the official major propaganda
A question
system.
for Dr. Seimer. A lot of the discussion on Nazi propaganda typically lingers in Europe, but as I understand it, and it's kind of hard to get information on it, there was a fairly successful campaign in North Africa that varied wildly from the European propaganda, and it seemed to have lingered well after World War II in many cases. Would you be able to speak on any of that and what the distinction between the Nazi European propaganda movement and the North African campaign movement might be?
Yes, the Germans benefited from the fact that the Arab world generally had felt betrayed by the decisions of the French and English at the end of World War I and the negation of the nationalist aspirations that they'd been promised. And so the Nazis were very active in courting any movement within the colonies, both French and English, that were resentful against colonial authority. And then, of course, most famously is their linkage with the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been founded in the 1920s in Egypt, where to the Nazis these were natural collaborators. And we're actually going to see Nazi collaboration with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, for example, will visit the Reich during the war. Himmler will envision tying, there was a Nazi publication called Islam and Judentum, the threat of international Judaism against the aspirations of both the Muslim world and the Grand Mufti is going to inspect the Muslim Waffen-SS divisions that had been raised in Bosnia, for example, the Hanshar or Scimitar division most conspicuously. So the Nazis left a legacy behind in many of the anti-colonial and radical Islamic groups. So it's an interesting observation for anyone who wants to look it up, but the salute of Hamas is this. So, at least in their parades 10 years ago.
As a footnote, several leading Nazi propagandists took up residence in Egypt after the war and continued anti-Semitic propaganda.
Yeah, that's quite so. After the war, with the newly independent Arab nations on the one hand, and the American support for the creation of Israel on the other, ex-Nazis were prominent in Syria and Egypt. And of course, Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist Party was based on the National Socialist model almost down to the design of the eagle they had as the national symbol of Iraq. So there's been a lot of work done on kind of the Nazification of this in the 50s and 60s, but I might add we can still see elements of this today.
Question for Randy. What was your experience writing Bending Spines? Like, how did you first get the idea to pursue this? Did you travel to Germany? What's it like there now? What's their opinion towards their own product of the 30s and 40s and 20s? Do they still talk about it? Did you spend weeks in the basement of archival buildings in the U.S. here writing this? Just curious.
Yes. No. I got into the area because I went to Calvin University, which, as the name suggests, likes John Calvin. And I did a senior paper on John Calvin's rhetoric, and I was in trance. I was going to do the great master's thesis on John Calvin. I got to Northwestern University and made a comforting discovery. If I was going to do original research on John Calvin, I had to know French and Latin. I knew German. One of the professors took me aside and said, look, Bytwerk, there's only two people in our field, communication rhetoric, who study propaganda, and one of them is damn mediocre. That was a very persuasive argument for a young graduate student. And so I did my first work was on Julius Streicher and antisemitism, and then ideas just kept coming. After about 8 or 10 years, people looked at me suspiciously. And so I thought I'd fool them because they were still German language propagandists, but they were now Marxists. So I started working on East German propaganda. And the more I looked at it, there were more similarities. There were differences, and the book covers it, but there are significant things alike. And so the idea occurred to me after about 15, 20 years of research, there's probably a book looking at the similarities and differences between the two systems. And that's really where Bending Spines came from. I spent a lot of time in German archives. As my wife can testify, basically there was lots of stuff there, and I would spend, a month or so sitting in libraries, archives, going through masses of documents. I benefited from the fact that in 1989, suddenly a lot of material became available because the East Germans had what was their Library of Congress, the Deutsche Bücherei, which was the depository library. Everything that was published went there. Now, the East Germans put it all into what they called the poison cabinet. Nobody could see it, but they were librarians. They did not destroy it. And so suddenly in 1989, it was all available. And I wandered into the German library and I said, here's what I'm interested in. What have you got? They said, how much time do you have? So I spent a lot of time there looking. Actually, I was the first person to look at a lot of the stuff in 40 years.
During the 1930s, if something would have happened to Hitler, say a car accident or a plane crash or a catastrophic health issue or assassination, who was his understudy? Who would have stepped in to take Hitler's place and continue with the propaganda?
See what you think, and I may have an opinion.
Well, it kind of depends on when he got hit by a car. The German historian Joachim Fest will write an essay where he says, and I think there's good grounds for his argument. Had Hitler died in 1938, he might well have gone down in history as one of the greatest German leaders. The real bloodshed hadn't started, and he had done an economic transformation of Germany and had regained its status as a great nation. So, had he died then, who would have stepped into his place? I'm not sure the expression "a moderate Nazi" would have taken its position. A lot of people that have kind of done this sort of counterfactual history have postulated that SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich was probably the most ruthless, best positioned, and young enough to he would have stepped over Himmler easily and then might have stepped into power. Now, the what ifs are, would the conspirators were going to put Rommel up as a replacement for Hitler, and it may well have been that in the fragile political structure of Germany before the war, the regime might have just folded into something. It might not have continued, in other words. Had Hitler been killed, it's not inconceivable the army would have moved against him and a democracy could have been restored. But during the war, of course, all bets are off. And then it's in the pecking order of the Nazi hierarchy. Heydrich's death at the hands of assassins in 1942 would mean that it would probably be up to Goebbels or Goering. Goebbels was a very popular figure in the Reich. For one of the reasons, he was willing to visit bombed out cities and really talk to the common people in a way that Hitler never did. And so he cultivated a popularity that was second only to Hitler's, I would argue, in terms of the Nazi top leadership. But I kind of wish that he would have gotten in a car wreck about 1928, but there you go.
I disagree a bit with that. The official line of succession varied, but for a while Rudolf Hess
True.
was, next in command. And during the war, once he got his act together again, I'd say, you mentioned Goering, and Goering had some genuine popularity as well.
True.
And I would agree, I would say that neither Hess nor Goering were scoundrels to the same degree as Hitler. They were both scoundrels. But I do not think that they had, Goering would never have, I don't think, implemented the Holocaust. The famous apocryphal line, I'm not sure if he actually said this or not, but he was reputed to have said, "I determined it was a Jew." He wanted to protect someone. So I don't think that either one of them would have carried out quite the same. On the other hand, they're both committed to the same Nazi ideology. So it's one of those fascinating counterfactual questions. And guess what?
Goebbels had a title, doctor. Do you know if he had an earned doctorate? If so, what was it in?
What was that, sir?
Goebbels had a title, doctor. Do you know if he had an earned doctorate, and if so, what was it in?
He did have an earned doctorate from Heidelberg, I think, a reputable university, and it was in German philology, kind of literature, something like that. It was a real PhD.
I didn't understand what you just said.
He had a PhD.
Okay.
And it was a real one.
And a real one. So we're going to call it a night here. Thank you all again.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.